Looking over my presentation last night, I was reminded of the Lincoln quote about the old preacher who said, "I could write shorter sermons, but once I get started, I'm too lazy to stop." So you'll be happy I did a little slashing, a little editing, and I've looked over your website of recent videos, and I at least can promise you that I won't be setting any records, so hang in there with me. A couple of decades ago, I was asked by the pastor of the church I was attending to be a part of a kind of lay panel or layperson panel discussion service one Sunday morning. This was, perhaps unknown to our new pastor, a rather risky move on his part, as the last time I had participated in fact, led a panel discussion in church was in 7th grade when I somehow convinced my Sunday school classmates and teacher that it would be a good idea to discuss the possibility of reincarnation as the subject of our youth-led Sunday service in this very traditional little church tucked away in the middle of the 1970s Bible Belt. And although the subsequent rebuke by the congregation was hardly of Joan of Arc proportions, it nevertheless taught me the dangers of challenging religious dogma and the importance of keeping my mouth shut, at least for a while, anyway. But this later panel discussion was not going to cover anything quite so controversial. The subject of this one was faith. What is faith? Where does it come from? Where does it lead us to? And those are all potentially interesting questions, but I actually remember none of it except for one particular moment when another panel member said that faith was like when he turned the key in his car ignition and he knew that it would start up even before hearing a sound. And I challenged that. I said, no, that's not faith, that's empiricism. You've turned those keys 100 times before. Your car's jumped to life every time. Faith, on the other hand, is a belief in something without proof. Faith, as the author of the book of Hebrews wrote, is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. In other words, believing in something without empirical evidence. And I remembered that incident initially because I thought I had made a brilliant theological point. I remember it now because I think maybe I wasn't so smart after all. Maybe faith, or at least religion or spirituality, shouldn't be so quick to give up empiricism, so quick to rely on merely, nothing? Maybe to have any legitimacy or credibility, faith should be built on something. The problem is, in today's Western society, there often has seemed to be little left. For at least 300 years, science has appeared to be at war with faith seemingly always on the losing side. Since Isaac Newton first got beamed by an apple, which of course probably never happened, science has been on the ascendance, systematically explaining away the mysteries of the universe that previously had been chalked up to the gods. Well, this conflict between science and faith was certainly a problem for me from my early teens on. My focus in education, even in high school, was on the sciences. My college major and minor were biology and chemistry, respectively, and I settled in the predominantly, although admittedly not exclusively, scientific field of medicine. And all this time, I considered myself a man of faith, yet my study of science gnawed away at the tenets of that faith. The virgin birth, the inerrancy of the Bible, miracles as something more than metaphors. I began to fear, that I was marching steadily toward an atheism and purely materialistic view of the universe that held no purpose or no meaning for me. I didn't want to go there, but I had to acknowledge that merely wanting there to be something more to the universe didn't make it so. And so the question became one of increasing urgency. How does one reconcile faith and science? Well, up to now, there have been three major strategies. The first is generally held by the more fundamentalist among us. If religion and science conflict, science is wrong. Again, with my training and even dependence on science in my daily life, this position was simply untenable to me. The second, the God of the gaps, as it's often called, is a holdover from ancient days, but I think it continues to be a very common approach, particularly among the lay population today. What cannot yet be scientifically explained must be a God thing. The gaps in our knowledge are the evidence of God. Now, there is a simple, appealing logic to this, but it came with a problem. With each scientific advance, the gaps grew narrower, pushing God further and further into the corner, limiting the Almighty, making him smaller and smaller until he had little room to operate and even less to evidence his existence. Now, the God of the gap strategy, though long-lived, is self-evidently not sustainable as a way to reconcile faith and science. It merely delays the inevitable, the failure of faith. And so a different strategy was needed in the world, at least of the scientific faithful, and one arose, one that to some degree is an oxymoron. The way to reconcile science and religion or faith is to separate them completely. God, as this theory goes, is entirely outside the physical world he created, and science can only deal with the physical. Neither, therefore, can have anything to say about the other. This seems to be the argument that's taken up by many members of the scientific community and academics these days, and I'll admit it does have the benefit of squashing any debate about the existence of God before it can even begin, which leads to less controversy in the lab or the classroom. But precisely because of that, it seems like a bit of a cop-out to me. And worse, if played to its logical conclusion, it undermines the very religion that it purports to uphold. If God truly has no connection to this physical reality in which we live our lives, then he is functionally dead, if not literally so, and religion is therefore irrelevant. If there's no one listening to either our appeals or our praise, why bother? Well, it's certainly not going well for faith, is it? And I would argue that the diminishment of faith has not gone well for society. There may be many reasons for the breakdown of societal cohesion and the norms that we are experiencing today, but it's hard to argue that the decline of religious faith isn't one of them. However, it may be helpful for promoting societal good behavior for God to exist, or at least for society to believe that God exists, but that doesn't mean he does. And if we can't prove him by specifically pointing to evidence that isn't there, the God of the gaps model, or by claiming that no evidence is possible at all, where does that leave us? Well, atheism is the obvious answer, isn't it? And it's an increasingly popular answer here in America, particularly with our youth, if polling on faith is to be believed. But I want to suggest here today that atheism, too, can be a bit of a cop-out. I'm not saying it is for any of my atheist friends out there, just that it can be. An easy way to deal with the idea of God and all that that idea implies can be simply not to deal with it at all. Just say it doesn't exist. Easy. And in some circles, popular. But more importantly, I'm also here to suggest that atheism may no longer be a scientific answer. Science may no longer be squarely on the atheism side. The scientific revolution of the 16th century, which sprang, interestingly enough, primarily from a Judeo-Christian motivation to understand God through his creation, and then tore away from faith through the powerful 19th century scientific theories of men such as Darwin and Freud, may now be tipping back towards its faith-based roots. No longer shrinking the gaps on theology, science itself may now be pointing in empirical, observational, positive evidence ways toward the possibility, even the necessity, of the metaphysical. In his best-selling book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, geophysicist and professor of philosophy Stephen Meyer describes several major scientific discoveries which he claims provide evidence of something more than mere cause and effect, more than pure scientific materialism going on in the universe. And I want to touch on some of these for a moment, as well as intersperse a few others as we go. The first, appropriately enough, is the beginning of the universe, the Big Bang. Most of us are pretty familiar with that latter term and, in fact, take it as accepted fact, but it's actually a relatively recent scientific concept. From the late 19th century until the mid-20th, the scientific community instead held to a steady state model of the universe. Matter, energy, time, space had always been. They were eternal, immutable. It wasn't until Edwin Hubble's discovery in 1929 that the universe was expanding, and the accidental detection in 1964 of cosmic radiation from some sort of ancient explosion, that the steady state model was abandoned and the Big Bang embraced. Now, if the universe was expanding in the forward progress of time, that meant it was shrinking as we head back into the past, and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until it all coalesced about 13 billion years ago into what is known as a singularity, so dense, so hot, that the laws of physics no longer apply and time, space, and matter no longer exist. The Big Bang then hits, and the universe begins. But here's the problem, at least for scientific materialism. Scientific materialism presupposes that A, matter, time, space, and energy are all that exist, and that B, everything must have a cause. But if time, space, matter, and energy all have a definite beginning before which they didn't exist, then there was no time, space, matter, or energy to do the causing. What then caused them to exist? Logically, it must be something else, something outside the materialistic universe. But it's not just that the universe began, it's how it began. The problem of fine-tuning. Many of you have heard this concept before, the idea of how improbable it was for anything to come out of the Big Bang. The fundamental forces at the beginning of the universe had to have very precise values. Gravitational force, the weak nuclear force, the electromagnetic force, the strong nuclear force, they all had to be tuned to the exact levels that they are for any of this to exist. In addition, the initial arrangement of matter and energy in the universe had to be just so for the development of galaxies, planets, and solar systems. British physicist Rover Penrose has calculated the odds of this arrangement occurring by random chance at 1 in 10 to the 123rd power. And there are literally dozens of other unfathomably improbable conditions for our existence that just happen to be correct. The cosmological constant, for instance, the outward pushing force that keeps our universe from collapsing on itself, is also tuned to an incredible degree of precision. The most commonly accepted number in the scientific community is 1 in 10 to the 90th power. That's the same odds as you blindfolding yourself and looking for one particular elementary particle, not just in the world, not just in the universe, but in 10 billion universes. Groundbreaking astronomer Sir Fred Hoyle, initially an atheist, came around to theism precisely because of his fine-tuning discoveries. A common sense interpretation of the evidence, he wrote, is that a super-intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology in order to make life possible. Life. The scientific study of life itself now seems to point to something beyond random chance and scientific materialism, even in its beginning on Earth. Most of us grew up being fed the idea of a primordial soup in Earth's past. Somewhere in a vast ocean or some tiny geothermal puddle, a random flash of lightning hit a random collection of chemicals at just the right random time, and poof, a primitive cell was born. This cell then divided and clumped together over billions of years and eventually gave rise to us all. And this was, in the 19th century, the time it was originally proposed, a pretty reasonable explanation. A cell was thought to be a little more than a simple blob of goop back then. So why couldn't a jolt of energy or a jolt of electricity breathe life into it, like Frankenstein's monster, and start the whole parade of Darwin's evolution? But we are no longer living in the 19th century, and we know that the simplest cells are not, in fact, rudimentary bags of chemicals, but rather incredibly complex and organized structures, requiring sophisticated cell walls, enzymes, organelles, internal transport systems, energy storage capabilities, and information control centers. It is universally recognized by origin of life research today that the beginnings of life have not been explained by scientific materialism. The mere idea that such interdependent complex structures could spontaneously arise and coalesce into even the simplest of cells is laughable at best. The existence of the single cell itself points scientifically to agency outside the materialist world. In fact, let's look at just one of those cellular structures, DNA. We all learned in high school that Watson and Crick first discovered the structure of DNA, the double helix, in 1953, and that was a landmark discovery in the study of biology. But arguably, the more important advance was made by Crick alone in 1957 when he published his sequence hypothesis that the subunits of DNA, nucleotide bases, encode the structure of proteins required by the cell, and not by their physical characteristics, but by their arrangement along the molecule. It is a sophisticated information storage, transmission, and processing system. Bill Gates has said DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we have devised. The renowned atheist, Richard Dawkins, admits that DNA contains machine code. And what we know from, quote, our uniform and repeated experience, which has long been held as the standard of scientific reasoning, is that code, or information, is always the product of mind, never mere material. Well, what of evolution or natural selection? These are well-accepted scientific theories. Don't these point to purely natural, indeed random forces as the principal guiding hands in the development of life? Well, maybe not so fast. Natural selection has been shown to explain variations within a species and rarely what might be considered new species, but never has it explained the development of any higher levels in taxonomic rank: genus, family, order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain. Experiments with E. coli bacteria, which produce a new generation every 20 minutes, so you can get a lot of generations, have never resulted in a new species. Radiating fruit flies to produce mutations in their DNA has produced no new species, only dead fruit flies. But there's a bigger problem with evolution, one which even Darwin recognized, and that's called the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion refers to the sudden appearance in the fossil record of practically all major animal phyla over a relatively brief period of time, 540 million years ago. Darwin himself recognized this as a major stumbling block, as his theory predicts consistent and gradual changes over time, for which there should be evidence in the fossil record. But to date, no transitional fossil forms have ever been found. Evidence of other such explosions in the diversity of life have also been subsequently discovered in the geologic record. These suggest, in the DNA language we used earlier, sudden infusions of information into the genetic code, something which scientific materialism cannot explain. These discoveries, for which scientific materialism has no explanation, the Big Bang, the fine-tuning of the universe, the complexity of the cell, code structure of DNA, the Cambrian explosion, these are all positive scientific observations rather than mere gaps in information. They are definable data points that suggest something outside of materialism, and therefore not just the gaps of old, and yet they don't really prove any alternative explanation either. Just that something beyond scientific materialism seems to be at play. It's fair to ask then if there's any scientific evidence of what? Well, I think there is. And a growing number within the scientific community appear to agree. And at least part of that evidence is coming from the mysterious world of quantum physics. And anybody who's heard me talk before here recently has heard that before. And if you haven't, you can check out the videos on the website. So I won't go too far into the weeds of the specifics, but suffice it to say that one of the surprising discoveries of quantum physics is the primacy of the observer. Traditional scientific method stresses detached observation to determine the nature of reality, but a number of experiments in quantum physics have shown that observation actually determines reality. A conscious agent seems to be necessary for the waves of outcome probabilities to collapse and for reality, our reality, to exist. This, as you might imagine, changes everything. But if consciousness is essential to reality, well, shouldn't science have some grasp on what that is? What is consciousness? Surprisingly, the material sciences have no answer for that. And this, in fact, is one of the most damning criticisms of the field. As Meyer has said, neo-Darwinism and materialistic ideas do not account for the really fundamental thing of our existence, which is the reality of consciousness, the reality of minds. We have them. We know minds exist. And if you can't account for that, you have a worldview that is inadequate. So far, there's actually no scientific evidence to prove that consciousness springs from the brain. But there is mounting evidence, this time from the field of medicine, that it does not. The medical study of near-death experiences, or NDEs, which are reported by up to 10% of the population and nearly a quarter of all cardiac arrest survivors, is not without controversy, but it's also not without objective, validated methods of data collection and analysis. And one of the clear conclusions from this field of study is that consciousness can and does operate independently of brain function in these cases. Consciousness lies outside the material world. So, a consciousness outside the physical world, what does that prove? Am I arguing here a scientific case for God? Does any of this, in fact, prove the existence of God? No to both. In the strictest sense, of course, science never proves anything. There is no such thing as settled science. Science is, according to popular science writer and psychologist David Hoffman, about coming up with better ways to be wrong. But it's also about determining the best explanation for the observations that have been made. And here are those observations. Number one, the best, in fact, the only explanation for the spontaneous beginning of a universe of energy, time, space, and matter is something other than energy, time, space, and matter. Number two, the simplest organism of which we are aware is far too complex to have arisen spontaneously. Number three, the best explanation for the information encoded into and required for life is a conscious agent. Number four, the theory of evolution as currently proposed by scientific materialism does not explain the development and differentiation of higher order life and does not fit the fossil record. An infusion of information, which always comes from a conscious source, is required. Number five, near-death experiences suggest that consciousness is, or at least can be, independent of the brain. And number six, quantum physics suggests that consciousness may be the underlying fabric of the universe and is in fact necessary for reality to exist. Now, this does not necessarily mean God, at least in the traditional theistic sense of a big semi-transparent guy in a toga sitting on a cloud, although it could. The data suggests only that there's something other than the material universe at play here, and that it exhibits characteristics we previously have only associated with consciousness. That the scientific hypothesis, and even Richard Dawkins admits this is a scientific hypothesis, the scientific hypothesis that there is a consciousness to or outside the physical realm is currently the best explanation for the data we have. That doesn't mean it will always be the best explanation, just that it seems to be now. Well, what are the implications of all this? What does it mean for your life and for society, if anything? Over the past year, I've had several interesting conversations, including a number with your own Dick Wolfsey, about philosophical topics, politics, penguin sex. You'll have to ask him about that one. And particularly about the notion of free will. Where does it come from? Does it exist at all? My own view, and this is just my own view, is that a scientific materialist must say no. Everything is either matter or energy, chemical and physical reactions. Everything has a materialistic cause, and every effect is therefore completely predictable if we just knew all the physical and chemical preconditions. And therefore, everything in the future is already, in a sense, set in stone. Choice is an illusion. There's therefore no right or wrong. Things simply happen or they don't. There's no meaning to them, and without right and wrong, without choice, without meaning, there's no basis for morality. There's no need for justification for the actions we take. There's no basis for judgment because those actions are already predetermined and beyond our control. The goal of existence then becomes just a matter of avoiding pain and increasing pleasure on a personal level. And this, my friends, is a depressing and scary prospect. This has horrible implications for society. That doesn't make it incorrect. It just makes it a horrible prospect. On the other hand, invoking, as science seems to now suggest, a consciousness behind physical reality and pure materialism leaves open the idea of free will. It leaves open the idea of something eternal, immune to the law of entropy that governs the inevitable decay of our bodies and the universe. And it does more than that. A consciousness of which we all are a part necessitates a concept of morality. It necessitates values of right and wrong, as if we are all, on some level, all one, doing unto others is doing unto ourselves. No, research has not proven that this consciousness, this creator of reality, exists. It is, to me, an appealing theory which presents a cohesive picture of the universe in which we find ourselves, one in which science and faith complement and support each other. But in the words of one of my favorite researchers, I'm probably wrong. Nevertheless, the pendulum of science, which for over 300 years has swung from its roots in faith toward the side of pure materialism, is now, I believe, swinging slowly, inexorably back. I thought I was being smart at that panel discussion in church years ago, downplaying the starting of a car as an act of faith, but I was wrong. Faith in something beyond our material reality, something eternal and meaningful, can't rest on nothing, or else it risks being empty, hollow, as it is for so many people, including so many churchgoers today. It has to be built on something. And maybe now we're getting there. Maybe science is catching up to theology. Time and research will tell. In the meantime, all I suggest is that we all keep an open mind. Keep our eyes on the data. Turn that key in the ignition and see what starts.